Perfect. So before we jump in, this is going to be a lot of me talking, but I also would love to see friendly faces. I can recognize some names here as well of people I know, and also some new folks, which is awesome. So yeah, like I said, I'm going to be talking a lot, but I'm also going to try to make this engaging. Hey, Jake. Yeah, so thanks so much for joining. Thanks so much for buying my book. This is the first, I think I've mentioned this a couple times to the group, but this is the first product that I've personally sold after starting my following. And so this is really, it's really cool to be part of and to see so many people be supportive. And I hope that you learned a lot if you've started reading the book. I hope that if you haven't read the book, you will get value from it. And if not, if you don't get a chance to read it, I hope these sessions bring you some value. So thanks for joining. Before we jump in, I thought we'd do a little bit of a quick intro. We won't be able to get through everyone, but I'll start by just introducing myself. I'm Steph. I wrote the book that maybe some of you have now read and the one that we'll be talking about. Full-time, I work at a company called The Hustle, which is one of the biggest newsletters in the world. And I work on their product called Trends, which is their premium product. But even before that, I've been working in marketing for quite some time. In general, mostly specialized in content, and I love marketing. I think sometimes it gets a bad rep, but I think if you really do marketing well, it's all about understanding psychology, understanding how people think, how to provide value for people, not trick them. And so I think hopefully what this book will get at least from a content perspective, is how you actually do that, how you understand the fundamentals behind content, how it's distributed, how that's changed over time. And how you can work with that system and not try to gamify it, not trying to hack it, but really just understand how it works. So that's a little bit about me. Before we jump into maybe some intros from people who have joined, let me make sure I can get this to work, but I have a couple polls. And so the polls are just quick things, since this is the first call that we're doing, to get a sense of, who's here, what you're looking to get out of this, if you've managed to get through the book or not. And so the first one, if I launch it, is just to get a sense of, we're going to talk about the first chapter today. If you've had a chance to read it, if you've had a chance to skim it, if you haven't touched it at all of them are fair game, but just to get a sense of how in-depth I should go when I cover the content. Cool. So it looks like, around half have actually gone through the whole thing. I'll let this run for a couple more seconds. Once I end it, you guys should be able to see the results. There we go. So 37 people have read the whole thing. Quite a few more have skimmed it, which is great. And at least, most people have at least read the summary. So that'll be helpful. We'll be diving into the content, and some of it will be repetitive if you have read the whole thing. But I find that, if you've read something, sometimes hearing it in a different form, audio, being able to discuss it just helps cement it more. So hopefully it's still valuable for the 37% who have read the whole thing. We'll do quickly a second poll, which is just to get a sense of where you're all at in your content journey. And what I mean by that is, have you been doing content for a decade and you're just looking to refresh things? Are you completely new to this and you're kind of using this as an experience to get yourself launched? Or are you somewhere in the middle? So yeah, I'll let this run for 5 more seconds, but it looks like most people are here and they're just starting, which is awesome, which means you can get even more, hopefully, from the material. But also what I think is important there is, at least from my experience, whenever you're in an industry for long enough, sometimes you forget what it's like to think with a fresh mind without being kind of jaded by the things that you've come to think are true over the years, even if those things are no longer true. So if you're coming into this new, I think that sometimes is actually even better, because you can learn from the beginning. You can learn about things from how they are now, not how they've been for the last 5-10 years. And then finally, one more before we jump in, which is it's this one. Yeah, so given that so the book is 5 or 6 chapters, and each of them focuses on a different thing. So this question is to get a sense of the people here, where do you need support? So I know we're going to be talking about chapter 1, but just want to understand, of the people attending, is this really the chapter that you are struggling with most? Are there other things that you have been running into walls with. So yeah, just have a second. Obviously, yeah, I feel like a lot of people maybe struggle with multiple of these things, but to get a sense of what's the number one thing that you are struggling with right now. I saw Ben's comment, I need an option for all of the above. Yeah, I mean, all of these overlap as well, right? And so positioning relates to writing. I'm going to get into this when I start talking about this first chapter, but I think this one especially overlaps with everything in that, you know, however you set your positioning is going to determine how you actually utilize different distribution channels. It's going to determine how you're able to monetize it or not monetize. All of that stuff relates to positioning. And so here are the results. It looks like a lot of people are struggling with positioning and distribution. Cool. So we're going to be talking about one of those topics today. So I'm going to stop with the polls there. And just before we jump into the material, I can see, you know, a lot of you on video, which is awesome. I'd love to hear from, you know, at least a handful of you, who you are, I guess 3 things. So name and who you are, like where you're from. If you're working on any sort of blog or publication, what is it? What's its name? Feel free to shout it out, let people know what it is and what it does. And then similar to the last question that we were, you know, the last poll is just, if you're struggling with something, what is it? What are you running into? And if you don't have something that you're struggling with because you're either too early or you're just smooth sailing, then just throw out a fun fact or something like that. And so I think we're a small enough group where we can actually just have people go. I initially was going to ask people to raise their hands, but I think we can actually just have people slowly start to go off mute if people are ready to volunteer.
I'll go real quick.
Cool.
I'm Chase McLaughlin. I'm in Arizona right now. I run a small incubator here around technology, and then on the side run an e-commerce store as well. But I really want to get into the content space and help kind of make my e-commerce store have a 2-prong offering and really focus on the new father space. So I'm really kind of looking for the whole suite of how to create content really at this stage, just looking to create good content and then work on monetizing someday as well. But it'd likely just be an add-on to my existing products.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Chase. Anyone else want to go?
I can go. Hi, I'm Richa. I'm from Seattle. I am I'm just starting out. And I want to document my journey going from a service business to a SaaS business. I am too early to have struggles right now. I'm very curious about the distribution piece.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Let's do maybe like 3 or so more. We won't be able to get through everyone, but anyone want to go next?
I'll go really quick. Andrew Ray here. I'm live in Columbus, Ohio. I work at a venture capital firm and venture studio here. I've been writing for about I've been doing content on like social media for a little over a year now. I was writing for about 6 or 7 months consistently on a blog with somebody else. The other author dropped off, and then due to long stories, some bandwidth issues, some drama issues at my firm, I kind of had to cut back on the writing for a little bit. But anyway, so really been looking to get back into it. Just got a new site set up, so hoping to start doing something consistently, and kind of just the goal to build and learn in public and try to build an audience as I kind of progress with my career and hopefully do some other interesting things. So nice to meet everyone.
Thanks, Andrew.
I'll go next. My name is Daniel Roger. I'm basically from Spain, from Barcelona. I'm working here just as a venture studio. We're a venture builder, and basically I'm in charge of research, getting new ideas for new markets. And I'm an expert on validating new products. And this is why I like trends so much. It actually helps me refine the way I analyze things. My long-term goal is to build my own companies. And I want to start a blog by myself where I teach how to validate new products and how to do research. So I'm still not struggling because I'm starting to build things, but so far, so good.
Perfect.
I can go next.
Go for it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. I'm from Toronto, and I work as a writer at a corporate law firm here, but I'm also leaning a little bit more into the copywriting space. I actually write some ads for The Hustle too. So that's been really fun, but I've built a site, have no idea what to do with it, what to put on there. So that's why I'm here.
Awesome. I'm from Toronto too, originally. Not there right now, but fun.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, if anyone else wants to go, feel free to drop your info in the chat. And I'll also hopefully try to send out a wrap-up email after this that potentially connects people from this call. But yeah, feel free to drop it in the chat where you're calling in from, what you do. But just in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is dive into the content. So what I'll do is, well, I'll share my screen first, but I'll be doing an overview of the chapter. Like I said, if you've read the chapter, it might be a little repetitive. There is some new stuff and some stuff that was actually, it's utilizing some of the content that some of the people on this call have sent in. There's a type form, so it's using some of that information. But then at the end, we'll jump into Q&A, and anything's fair game for Q&A. So if you do have questions throughout, you can either, since we're a pretty small group, you can interrupt me. You can say, hey, Steph, that didn't make sense. Can you explain that, or can you elaborate on that? You can also add it into the chat, but I won't be monitoring the chat super closely as I'm presenting. But if you do add it to the chat or want to go off mute at the end, I'm here to stay as long as you guys need me. All right, so we'll be talking about your personal monopoly. That's kind of a fancy term for really finding, what you should be writing about and why, and then who you should be writing about for, or writing about that for. I find that people often jump into this or jump into writing or creating an online publication without doing at least one of those things. So sometimes they might think about the topics they're writing for, but they don't identify the audience who they're actually trying to target. Sometimes they kind of skim over that entirely and just jump in and just start writing things. That can work, but I think if you actually take the time to identify your personal monopoly, you're almost shortcutting your way to what people might kind of test and iterate and experiment and then eventually end up at. This will help you, I think, get there more quickly. All right, so the best way to understand how to create great content is actually to learn the fundamentals about, at least in this digital era, how content works and how we got here. And so this is, again, something fundamental that I think a lot of people maybe would recognize if you told them, but don't think about when they're actually identifying where to start. And so let's go all the way back to the 60s when, if you grew up in the 1950s, you had no way to, if you wrote something, if you wrote a letter, you would have no way to actually get that information in front of someone, in another continent. Right? We had Daniel from Spain. Like, I would never be able to, show him. I would never be able to have this session overall. But even, in the 50s, let's say there was newspapers, there was radio, but it was very limited in terms of A, who could create content, and also B, who could that content be distributed to. And so in the 60s, the early kind of vibrations of the internet got started. And then in 1989, thanks to Tim Berners-Lee, we got the World Wide Web. So that was really kind of foundational in creating something where anyone, anywhere, if they had access to this web, could now interact with other people who were along the nodes of that web. So really, really game changing. But even then, even though the World Wide Web started in 1989, it wasn't for another 5 years when specifically writing online became more common, as in writing in terms of like how we view it now, blogging. With Steve Gibson was he's viewed as the first full-time blogger. But then again, it took another 5 years for platforms to start existing. So platforms enabling people. I don't know that much about Steve's story, but I assume that either himself or someone he hired had to create a site for him. What he didn't get to, log on as we do today to WordPress or Ghost or whatever platform you use and just start writing. And so in 1999, Blogger was founded. But then I would say the turn of the century is when things really started to accelerate. So I call this the internet age. There's many reasons that people call, the 21st century, the internet age, or era. But specifically as it relates to digital content, 2003, WordPress was founded. Now WordPress powers, I think it's like 30%, 30+% of the web. But again, in that decade following WordPress being founded, all these other companies that we're familiar with today, Squarespace, Wix, Ghost, Drupal, all of these companies that make it so easy for us and everyone else in the world to publish online were founded. And then 2016, not that long ago, right? We're in 2020, was really, I think, if you look at the graph, so I talk about this in the book, there's a tool called BuiltWith, where you can see how many sites are using specific tools, but you can really see that around 2015, 2016 is when you just start to see this like inflection of so many sites going online, and in particular blogs. And so WordPress sites in 2016 had 5x from 2011, or relative to 2011. And then now we're here in 2020, and there's billions of websites out there. In Q1 of 2020, there was over 300 million new domains registered. So you can tell that people are participating more, but really what's important to understand is they're participating because they can, right? And so only up until the last 5 to 10 years could anyone with an internet connection actually decide, hey, I have something to say and I want to go say it. And so you can see that it's not just with people over here on the left, it's not just people creating long form content per se. It's also tweets, Google searches, 500 hours of video is uploaded to YouTube every minute. These stats are per minute. So it's really insane just how these tools were created and how they enabled everyone to have a voice. But what comes with that voice is a lot of competition. And so the question then becomes, if there's so many people that now have access to speak online, which is amazing, it's definitely a net positive, how do you stand out if you want to be one of those people and have people read your stuff? So I'm going to talk about 4 things that relate to this. I talked about one a little bit already, which is this concept of reduced barriers. So it's so much easier for anyone to publish online. So if that's true, how do you stand out? Well, you need to be an innovator. And if you want to be an innovator, I'll talk a little bit more about this thing called the diffusion of innovation curve, and how you can basically either start a new curve or find yourself at the early stage of an existing curve. Then something that's really important to understand is, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but the internet did not just change our ability to publish online, or these tools didn't change that only, it also changed our ability to distribute effectively. In the past, we only had certain channels, very defined channels, very rigid channels, and now we have endless channels, which we'll talk about in chapter 3 as well, but that was a very fundamental change. And then 4, we'll talk about the power law. So given that we have all these new channels and all content online is so much more accessible, there's a new law that I think is stronger than it was in the past, and it's the power law, which basically, I'll get into it in a little more in a bit, but basically attention is not linear, and attention is now distributed in much more disproportionate ways than it was in the past, and therefore you need to understand that and address that with your strategy. All right, let's get into some specifics. So this one we've gone over a little bit already, but very quickly. So supply and demand have both grown for online content over the last decade or so, but they haven't grown symmetrically. So everyone, people I think do read more content online than they did, let's say 10 years ago, but the amount of content that's being produced alongside that demand is not proportional at all. And again, it's because of this ease of entry. And so now there's so many people who weren't publishing before that are just doing so for fun, right? Some people who do it for their jobs, some people who want it to be their jobs, but regardless, there's all these people who are now putting information online that were not before. And when that happens, something to understand here is that just because there is a lot of supply doesn't mean that there is not any gaps anymore. And what I mean by that is, as I mentioned, a lot of people are putting content online these days just because they can, because they have the opportunity and the right to do so. But when that happens, when people are just doing it without much of a purpose or without much of a strategy, there's a lot of bad content out there. I'm sure many of you have encountered a lot of, less than quality content, and that is a result of this, lower barrier to entry. So that's something really important to keep in mind. Just because there is a ton of content out there, that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't gaps for you to continue to address. Now, let's talk, okay, if you do want to be an innovator, if you do want people reading your stuff, how do you do that? I think one of the other fallacies is that because there are, so many people who write online already about so many topics, people actually revert away from competitive areas. And what I mean by that is a lot of people will say, you know, there's X thousand keto blogs out there, there's X thousand travel blogs out there. And I'll touch on this in a little bit when I talk about saturation. But I think what people don't understand is that saturation or competitiveness in an area sure is an indicator that you should pay attention to, but it shouldn't be the end all be all. And what you should be focusing on is this concept of, can I be an innovator? And the way to be an innovator is either by addressing something new. So in that case, you're addressing something that other people have not addressed in the past. And in that case, you really are in a non-competitive space. That's what people normally lean towards. But that's incredibly hard to identify, especially with so many people creating now. So much content is online. It's really hard to find a space that's not at least a little bit competitive. Now, the second is where I think there's actually more opportunity, but people, again, avoid because they think spaces are competitive. And the second is actually addressing what already exists, what may already be competitive, but just ensuring that you're actually creating something that is tangibly better than what exists out there right now. The world always has room for things that are even just 1% better than what exists today. And I go through a bunch of examples of this in the book, but this is a really core point. People always, will try to look for markets or topics that no one's writing about. And if you can do that successfully, kudos to you, but that's incredibly hard to do. What's better is to actually, or what's easier to do is to identify what exists and ask yourself, how can I do this better? And if you do that, you're either going to, if you identify something new, you're going to have this fresh curve that no one's addressed before. You're going to be right here at this innovator stage. But even if you find something old and do it better, you're likely going to create either a pseudo curve or a curve of your own, just by, again, iterating on something that exists already. All right. So I talked about this a little bit, the saturation concept. So saturation is, I would say, one of the most misunderstood things, especially with content, especially because there is almost no niche in content these days that is not at least partially saturated. And so saturation is not the sheer number of people in a space. That's not what matters. It's the likelihood that you can out-innovate what already exists. And so there's two concepts here that I want to talk about. So the first is, can you out-innovate what already exists? And these are two imaginary markets, right? People naturally often will gravitate to this market on the right because there's less players. But these colors are meant to kind of indicate whether something is currently addressing needs effectively. So, green is they're addressing needs very well. Yellow is, some in the middle, and red is not addressing those needs. And you can see that even though this hypothetical market has many more players in this market, these players are either, just satisfactory, or they're not really doing a great job to meet customers' needs, versus these three players, even though there's less, are doing a really great job of addressing the needs of the people who require that market, and they each will take up much more market share, and there's not going to be as much room for someone to out-innovate them. Two great examples of this, I'll dive into Costco a little more in a bit, but are Costco and Stripe, both in very competitive industries. These are, of course, companies and not newsletters, but the same premise still lies, where Costco was in retail, just general retail, found a way to differentiate from people or other companies that existed, and just killed it. Stripe, similarly, in payments, another incredibly competitive space, but found a way to be better than what existed out there. And they entered very competitive markets, but did it much better. And so the point here is, don't be afraid to enter competitive markets, but just make sure that you do have an edge. And I'll talk about the edge more in future slides. Now, the other place that people go wrong is that they choose areas that people just don't care about. And so, again, people stay away from competitive industries or topics. But if something's competitive, that actually, at least in one sense, indicates that people care about it, right? There are currently competitors in that market who have market share, who have customers that pay money or engage with what they're doing. And that is a signal that people care about that thing. Now, what a lot of people do is they try to target things that, no one is tackling. And again, there are cases where this works, but it's very hard. And there's this great quote from Paul Graham, or I think it was actually a tweet. And it was basically, him talking about people who have product ideas, and he goes, you have an idea, you check whether it exists, it doesn't, good sign, right? Well, maybe not. Maybe you're the first to think of it, but maybe it's actually just an idea that people think of all the time, and the reason it doesn't exist is that it never works. And the same is true for content, where you could just be writing about things that people don't actually care about. And so you have to make sure that you're gut checking your decisions here, not just in terms of who's already there, but if you can out innovate them, and if you are choosing a topic that a lot of people don't seem to be writing about, make sure people actually care about that thing. All right, so we're moving on to the third concept, which is this idea that the internet did not just change our ability to create and publish content, it changed the distribution mechanics. And what I mean by that is, in the past, let's go back another 50 years again, if you were writing, or if you wanted to reach people with writing, you likely did it through something like a newspaper or a radio station. Now, those were very defined channels where, if you lived in Dallas, you'd get the Dallas Star, and maybe there'd be a Challenger newspaper, but those were the only mechanisms to reach people, and they would reach people at scale. And for those reasons, those newspapers as well would not write about niche topics, because they would do better writing about topics that would appeal to the masses, because that was the only way to reach people, was through the masses. Now, the internet has amazingly created all of these nodes that you can connect in very niche, intertwined ways that has allowed us to reach people who care about very niche things. So you can actually today go create a newsletter about microchips, and just through certain channels, through certain communities, through Google and trying to rank on certain topics, you can actually reach people who care about microchips, and only those people. And so this is really fundamental to understand, because it ties into this fourth idea, which is the power law. And this power law ties into the previous point, because what happens when now anyone can reach your content and reach all content? Well, the best stuff surfaces to the top, right? And so in the past, if you had an amazing article that you wrote for the Toronto Star, well, unfortunately, only people in Toronto could read it, right? The Dallas Star wouldn't be publishing about it. People in Dallas wouldn't know about it. But now, when you write something, if it's really good, it can reach everyone. But for that reason, you're now competing with everyone in the world. You're no longer just competing with people who are immediately adjacent to you by location or some other metric. And so what happens there is you get this completely disproportionate, this law that basically the quality of your content, and I'm not talking about length, I'm talking about the quality, whether it actually addresses someone's need, that is going to disproportionately, if you actually address that well, you're going to get a disproportionate amount of attention. It basically means that, only a few people win the entire pie now. And in this case, the internet is seen as an equalizer. In many ways it is. In this case, it really just means that the best content wins, and always wins on the internet. And so with this true, you then need to understand, okay, well, how do I get in this column, right? Like, how do I get in this top 1%, top 5% of content that gets all of the page views? Well, you need to be tangibly better in an area, and you need to be tangibly better in an area that people care about. So let me give you an example that is, again, not a content business, but I think this example highlights exactly what I'm talking about. And so Costco, I think many of you on the call are familiar with this company. It's done incredibly well. This is their stock chart. I pulled it this morning over the last 2 decades. And, short story is they've killed it, right? And so there are so many people who have tried to create retail stores. And again, not a non-competitive market. It's extremely competitive. And there was many very long-standing companies who were already in this market. But Costco had a very focused approach, and they targeted one thing that people care about. So Costco, it's funny because we're so used to the name Costco. I didn't realize until I was making this slide that the word cost is literally in their name. And if you actually pull up their mission, it's to continually provide our members with quality goods and services at the lowest possible prices. That is so straightforward. You see so many mission statements these days that are, a lot of hullabaloo that doesn't really mean anything. Their goal is to provide their customers with the lowest possible prices. And when you work in retail, there's many things that you can optimize for. So you can optimize for costs like Costco did. You can optimize for ambiance. You can optimize for package sizes, service, how easy is it to get to locations, how many brands are you actually, how many SKUs are actually in your store. There's even more things than this. But what's important here is people don't choose products, whether it's products or online content, based on the average of things that you could care about. They choose things based on what they care about the most and what is the best solution for that one thing. And so that one thing changes depending on if you're buying a product versus if you're reading something online, and it changes per person. But what's important here is Costco identified there is a huge cohort of people who care about cost, and that is their number one metric that they care about. And so they focused on that. Costco, if you walk into a Costco, it's literally like a warehouse. It's hard to get to their stores. You have to buy packages of like 8 Q-tips. Have you ever talked to someone in Costco to actually get you help? None of these things. They're actually incredibly bad at many of these things. But they found, again, one thing that people care about, and they optimize for that. All right, so with that in mind, the same principles actually yield for online content. And so when you're creating your content, what a lot of people focus on is, what are the topics I'm writing about? And that is important. But what you should equally be focused on is, what are you actually going to be better at than the other people who are writing about the exact same things? Because trust me, like I said before, there's almost no niche in content that doesn't at least have someone who's competing with you. And so what can you be better at? There's so many things. These are all, just think of different adjectives, right? You can be funnier, you can be more opinionated, you can be more visual, you can be more thoughtful, you can be more deeply researched, you can optimize for a specific group. There's so many ways that you can be better, but you must be better in one way. And again, you must be better at something people actually care about. To kind of give a facetious example, you could create a newsletter and you can make that newsletter, all yellow, right? And that would be the most yellow newsletter in the world. But, people don't care if your newsletter is yellow. And so you need to make sure that the people that you're trying to target actually care about the thing that you're optimizing for, as Costco did. They knew that people cared about cost. And this is just a couple of quick examples of there was an Indie Hackers post a couple of weeks or months ago, and it asked simply what are your favorite newsletters and why do you like them? And you'll notice here that the reasons that people actually put for enjoying these newsletters was not they talk about business and tech, because everyone talks about business and tech, or it wasn't that, they wrote a story about X today. It's how they actually talk, or how the actual information is communicated. And so just to give a couple examples, short and to the point, basically the second one is saying it feels like a professional writer wrote them, so higher quality, snappy data visualizations that are quick to read. So in this case, it's visual, but more importantly, it's quick. It's helping people who care about their time. And so I asked for people who were attending the session to fill out a type form before this, and these were the results of the people who filled it out in terms of their favorite newsletters. So you can see here, again, if you actually look at the reasons that people like these newsletters, there's a couple examples here where people are talking about how it touches on specific topics, but far and away, most of the comments here are about, how this information is being delivered. So well-researched, authentic, quality writing. I love to see The Hustle on here because I work for them. I'm obviously biased, but The Hustle consistently gets people who like The Voice, who think it's really funny. And in this case, they're saying, they write interesting content even when it's about boring topics. James Clear's 321 newsletter was the most, at least from this very small submission, the most submitted one. I also subscribe to this newsletter, and the common theme here is that it's high quality but crisp. It's super succinct and sharp. And so again, you just have to find something. James Clear targets people who care about their personal development, who care about progressing, but they also care about their time and they're super busy. And so he's addressed that by having probably the shortest, the sharpest newsletter out there for that cohort of people. So I'm going to pause here before moving on, and just I'd love it if anyone has any thoughts either on the newsletters that are here, if you have any other examples of newsletters that you really love in your inbox, and if you'd like to elaborate on why you think you love it or why other people might love that newsletter. Does anyone have any thoughts here?
One thing with the hustle that we always like was the shower thoughts on Fridays. They were always just like really clever and original, and so like now my boyfriend and I will be like, oh, did you see the shower thoughts today, or like there was a good one today. So I think that's an example of like almost like a niche feature within the newsletter.
Yep, totally.
It brings people back. Yeah.
That's actually like the thing that people write in the most about at The Hustle, which is interesting because to your point, we wouldn't say it's a core feature, but it addresses some need that people aren't getting in other places, even though it's not necessarily a core feature again. Any other thoughts?
Yes, I wanted to ask, how do you know what people in your market care about most? So let's say you want to start a newsletter, right, in a certain market segment, let's say like business news. How would you like understand what adjective people care about most?
So there's let's say use business and tech news as an example. There's going to be people who care about different things, right? So that's really important to keep in mind. Like The Hustle and Morning Brew basically have the same audience or a very similar audience. They trade on different things. And so what you want to do is identify, of the like wider industry that you may be targeting, and I'll talk about this in a little bit with this idea of like, who are your true fans, your 100 true fans, like who are the like very core people that you're trying to target. And you should be able to, as it talks about in the 100 true fans, like you should be able to write like a paragraph about who this person is. And if you can't do that, go find that person, right? Go interview people until you find someone that loves your content, right? And then go talk to them and say, hey, like, let me learn more about you. Where can I find 100 more people like you? And also, what part of the newsletter, like, why do you open this every morning? And also, what other newsletters do you open? And that's another trick. If you interview people, ask them what other things they read, not just to find out what topics they care about, but to understand like if everyone, if that individual reads a bunch of like very short newsletters, you probably can gather that person really cares about their time and optimizes for that. Do you know what I mean? Versus you might find that someone subscribes to like all super long form newsletters and really cares about depth. And so it's a common like piece of advice in startups, but if you don't know who your core users are, go find that out first and then interview them, talk to them before trying to scale. Content, you don't necessarily need to wait, but it's something that you should do as soon as possible. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I see why, like, James Clear, because it's about habits. It would be concise and about like really sharp in terms of like people that want to be really productive, right? So it makes sense.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed some of the Axios newsletters, and one thing I don't know if others do, but the fact that they say how long it's expected to read that, and to really, they're even their tagline of smart brevity, where you're going to get a lot, but they kind of really lay it out for you. So I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, huge fan of Axios. Also, the one that I call out in the book all the time is Charter. It's like my favorite newsletter to talk about, which basically has done it in a different, instead of shortening the writing or the content they're serving, they've just translated it into a completely or mostly visual form for busy people like me who just I want to get my business and tech news. I still read The Hustle as well, but Charter just does it so effectively of translating complex information into something visual that you can read in like 2 minutes. So again, that they're trading on some, maybe people at surface value would think that they're trading on like being more visual, but in the end, they're also trading on time and people who don't have enough of it. All right, sounds like we should keep moving. All right, so in summary, these are the fundamentals. We're not done this section, but these are the 4 things that you gotta kind of like nail into your head. This understanding that, you know, there is a ton of content and that does make things more competitive. It's certainly harder to become a successful, oh, I think someone can go on mute. Actually, I'll just unmute. There we go. So yes, it's much harder to become a successful content producer in 2020 than it was in 2015, let's say, but that does not mean that it's impossible. You just need to understand that in the sea of really, you know, mediocre content out there, you must do something much better. And you must do so by understanding that, you know, there are some amazing new distribution channels that are available to you online, but that also means in order to target the right people, to target more segmented people, you need to understand what they want and what they care about. And if you can do that, if you can create content that a very specific group of people want, doesn't need to be a small group, specific is not necessarily small, then you will reap the disproportionate rewards of the internet, right? Remember I said that the pie is not linear in this case, like the pie gets owned by a discrete number of people at the top of this, like, you know, content pyramid, let's say. And if you're able to create something even 1% better than what exists out there, you will reap those disproportionate rewards. All right, so the question I get often is, okay, so that's cool. I need to find something that I can do very, very well. Like, what does that mean? What should I actually start with in that case? The reason that this chapter is called Your Personal Monopoly is because that is the easiest place to start. It's not the only place to start, but it is the easiest place to start, especially if you're unsure where to. And so a personal monopoly is just some fancy term for saying basically a differentiator, whether it be a skill that you've spent a lot of time progressing, certain level of experience that other people wouldn't have access to, or even just an understanding of how certain things work that other people haven't figured out yet. And so anything that you've spent an above average amount of time learning can be translated into information that is going to be valuable for the average person. That's a quote from the book, but this is kind of a visual where if you imagine over here on the left, someone knows nothing about a topic, and over here on the right, someone knows everything about a topic. You don't need to be here. A lot of people wait till they're here, but if you anywhere above average, or really anywhere along the spectrum, is if you are able to capture that knowledge and pass it along successfully to people, anyone below you on the spectrum will find that valuable because they haven't made their way up the spectrum like you have. And an important thing to keep in mind is this is true for companies too. So a lot of people, you know, you think personal monopoly, like, oh, this is for individuals. This is any skill, experience, or understanding or a piece of information that you have. So as a company, like, what data do you have that makes you have a specific view of the world that other people don't have access to? Or what have you learned, you know, let's say you're a payments company, what have you learned about how payments have evolved or changed or function over the last number of years that other people who maybe aren't payments companies would actually find very valuable? So very important, it's not just individuals, it's for companies. Now, how do you actually, you know, once you think about like the wide range of things that you might know about or have experience with, how do you actually nail that down into topics? I like this concept of idea ikigai, which is ikigai is a concept from Japanese, which is about like finding your meaning, and it's this intersection of 4 circles. So this is an iteration of it, of 3, but it's basically this idea of like what do people care about? What's interesting that you can write about? So this is number 3, that you can contribute to, that doesn't exist in its exact form. And it's very intentional that I say here in its exact form. It may exist in some form, but again, if you can iterate on it in a way where you are contributing to it and making it even just 1% better, there is room for that. And so just to give a concrete example of my experience, before I started my personal blog, there was many years where I wanted to, never did it. And then finally, I only started writing for my personal blog when I felt like I had, you know, this personal monopoly where I had, you know, worked remotely and led a remote team long before many people did. I taught myself to code in under a year. Again, I wasn't necessarily, if we go back here, I wasn't necessarily at the top of this spectrum, but I was above average in many areas that I'm talking about. And everyone who was, in this section could benefit from what I was talking about. And, just to give a couple other examples, there's people who write about anything from like learning Google Sheets to newsletters that send Drake lyrics or medicinal marijuana deals. One of the ones I really love is this guy who just is super creative and has access to a 3D printer, and he creates these unnecessary inventions. And so it doesn't need to be, again, you don't need to be the number one in the world, but you do need to find this intersection of what can you uniquely contribute to, what doesn't quite exist yet, and what do people care about. And if you don't know where to start, you start with your obsessions and you work backwards. And so this is something I'd encourage you in general to just follow your curiosity often. But once you've done that for a certain period of time, just consistently ask yourself questions, and this will change over time. But what's something that you've done that a majority of the population hasn't done? What's an insight that you have that other people may not, again, have access to or might not have thought of? What's something that you basically have spent the time doing that you can translate to other people and reduce the time that they would require to learn that exact same thing? What's something that you wish existed 5 years ago? And finally, what's something that you think about in the shower a lot? Just, if you're not sure what to write about at the beginning, just spend some time and ruminate on it. You don't necessarily need to hop into creating your, digital home immediately. I think it's actually better if you take the appropriate amount of time at this step to really think about this. Now, a couple other things. I think we're almost done. But your niche, I use the term niche and kind of synonymously sometimes with personal monopoly, but your niche isn't your specialty. And when I say niche in this case, it's not a niche topic necessarily. It can be, but it doesn't need to be. And what I mean by niche is going back to that Costco example, what's your niche value or your niche positioning? What is something that you do differently? Doesn't need to be a small market. And something to keep in mind here is people are not monogamous with their content. And what I mean by that is that, if you go buy groceries, if you bought groceries for the week, you're not going to go and buy another load of groceries until you need it. Now with content, because most content is free, people are happy to, if they're subscribed to 3 personal development newsletters out there and they discover a really good one, they'll add a 4th. They don't feel the need to as much, pick and choose between one option or the other. And so there's room, again, if there's competitors out there, as long as you're providing value to the audience that you're trying to. And finally, you don't need to stay niche, but specificity, if you are specific at the beginning, will help you identify your audience. It'll help you form a thesis and get traction. And these are some companies and some newsletters that give you an idea of how you can start very, very niche and grow from there. Facebook is the perfect example of it. It was basically a hot or not app. Now it does everything. And so you don't need to stay niche forever, but it is important to focus on your specialty at first so that you can really nail things down. So quickly, one of the things that I encourage you to do through the exercises and through the book is to determine your one-liner. And this is another common practice from building startups, but you should be able to parse what you're trying to do into one sentence. And if you can't do that, that generally will kind of indicate that you don't have a really solid understanding of what you're trying to accomplish, or that what you're trying to accomplish is far too broad. And so in this case, you want to basically identify what you're trying to do or what value you're providing. But in this case, you also want to, especially for something like content, tack on the who, right? So these are some examples. Numlocks, the newsletter, it's Good Morning America for nerdier folks. This is, in their words. Farnham Street, noise canceling headphones for the internet. Brad Reed's Oprah for millennials. Morning Brew, Wall Street Journal for millennials. Refactoring UI is an amazing ebook that got a lot of attention, sold an incredible number of copies, and it was design training, but there's a ton of design training out there, but in this case they tailored it to a very specific audience for developers, and they did super well. So make sure that you take the time to think about what you're creating for who and parse it into a sentence so that you can make sure that you understand what you're trying to do. And then finally, figure out who your 100 true fans are. So this relates to Daniel's question, but from earlier. But a true fan is someone that benefits from your solution a disproportionate amount. So you're going to have, hopefully, in your content career, many more than 100 fans. But at the beginning, especially, who are the core people that you're creating for, that you understand, and don't just stop at saying, I'm writing for tech junkies. Actually identify, like, who is this person? Go talk to people. Where do they work? What do they read? What communities are they in online? Like, what types of problems do they face every day? These problems, again, aren't just content related, but like, are they super busy? Are they in meetings all day so they can't read newsletters, that are super long? What pain points do they face weekly, monthly? I'm not going to read this example, but this is a good example of just someone who has deeply thought about exactly who their customer or their reader in this case is, down to all of these questions. And then the final thing that I won't talk about in too much depth here, but is once you've done this, take a second to just at surface level, at the very least, to consider, do I know how to reach these people? Because often people might, know who their audience is, but then when you actually go to the drawing board and think about what, online channels exist, they realize, I don't actually know how to reach these people. And it's possible that they can figure it out. This is something that you want to really at least gut check at the beginning stages to make sure that, you can reach these people. Now, I have one more poll for the group, which I will pull up. And it is, let me just pull it up here and launch it. So I just went through, I think, most of the personal monopoly stuff. I think the final slide is just a summary, but given the things that we've gone over, and if you've read the section, I'm curious to know, how did your point of view on either your current publication or your future publication, how did that change, if it did? What did it change? Did it mean you had to rethink what you were differentiating on? Did it change who you were targeting? Or are you still processing the information? Give us another 5 seconds. And
all the above option.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna end the poll, but I'd love to hear if people are willing to share, if you did have to rethink any part of your personal monopoly, what was it? What made you, what was the realization you had? What are you now exploring? Anyone willing to share?
Yeah, I'll love to share. I love the idea of this personal monopoly, but I'm always afraid that, as you were saying, I'm always led by curiosity, but like the more you find the niche, the less you can be just driven by your pure curiosity and touch on many things. So the question is like, is it worth to really go down that road, and what's the trade-off? And I've been kind of thinking about that.
Yeah, so I like to kind of use the analogy of a friendship, in the sense that, so as I mentioned on one of these slides, like, you don't need to stay niche. And in fact, if I go back to, let me actually just go back to this slide. So all of these companies and, Tim Ferriss and Shane Parrish, like, they started out very niche and they did not end up niche at all, right? And the reason I use this friendship analogy is because it's like when you meet a friend, right? You normally meet them, maybe at a soccer game or at a meetup where you're talking about some topic that you care about. When someone meets you somewhere, right, on the web, it's similar. They're exposed to some part of you. You're way more diverse, and you have way more depth than what they read from a single article of yours. But when they first meet you, and when you're first starting up your blog, like, you need some entry point, something for you to connect over, right? And so the reason I emphasize that people should start specific, again, niche is sometimes a misleading word, but specific, is so that you can form that relationship, you can form a common ground with your readers. And then as you start to build up your audience, you can explore as much as you want. And I actually encourage you to not really stay in necessarily the same topics, because your personal monopoly can change over time too, right? Personal monopoly, if just reiterating, is anything that you have a certain level of expertise in or a certain amount of insight in. And that in itself can be a diverse range of topics, right? But to start, I would just encourage people to really nail down who are your 100 true fans, and focus on a subset of topics, right? Maybe not all the ones that you care about, and then slowly expand over time as you see fit. So that I completely understand the sense that it can be limiting and you don't always want to, talk about the same things. But similar to a friendship, you start out, you meet them at, maybe the developer meetup for 3 weeks, and then you go and say, hey, you want to grab a coffee? Eventually they're your best friend and you talk about everything, right? And so I see things similar to that. And that's why.
Makes sense. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay.
It's Steph.
Hey.
Can I chime in? Nassim here.
Hey, yeah.
So
Sure.
I've been a fan of yours since Trends, right? So that's how I've been following you. And in fact, one of the newsletters you mentioned there was David Perel, right? He was a guest on the Trends, and I did the rite of passage. Very interesting. So we talk about personal monopoly in there too, but what your chapter helped clarify a little bit was, so my personal monopoly is supply chain, is where I worked in about 15 years. And for the past 8 years, I've had my own company in recruiting and consulting. So, I know supply chain better than most recruiters and recruiting better than most supply chain. That's my personal monopoly. But the approach of 1,000 fans versus 100 is very helpful because, I may think more in one area is more important to me versus the others. But where's the actual market, right? Is the market more on helping supply chain folks in their career? Or is it more on helping the career folks learning better supply chain? So that really helped crystallize for me that, okay, if I were to drill this down to 100 true fans, I would be focusing more on one over the other. And that may be my place to start. And then, as you talked about in the book, build your credibility. Once you get that, then you can kind of venture into other areas, but have a good foundational starting point. Hone in on that and build off of that. So just wanted to share. Great job on the book too. Keep it up.
Thanks so much. And just touching on that point, I mentioned this in the book a little bit, but sometimes it can be confusing if you have multiple audiences. And so sometimes it's useful to think about things in almost like a primary, secondary, sometimes even tertiary audience, where if you think about, let's say, even if you're targeting entrepreneurs, right? But then also you may be, targeting like aspiring entrepreneurs, or you may be targeting people who work in tech and business but maybe aren't entrepreneurs themselves. It's like, what is the core person that you're trying to target, and who is almost at like the top of that supply chain? You're talking about supply chain, so who's at the top of that pyramid, where if you are actually writing for expert level entrepreneurs, seasoned entrepreneurs who know it, who've done it, you by nature are likely going to attract the aspiring entrepreneurs or people who are just, vaguely interested in entrepreneurship, because you're writing the best of the best for the people who know what they're doing. Versus if you did the opposite and you wrote, just about like people who are just starting out, the people who are, already far along in the game are not going to care. They're not going to read your stuff. And so in general, it's often better to focus on experts, because by nature, you kind of loop in people who are non-experts, who are aspiring to be experts, if that makes sense. Cool. Any other thoughts on, if you had to rethink your monopoly, if you didn't, and you got, a clear vision the whole way through? Any other thoughts there?
Just a thought, and maybe as much a question as a thought, but so for someone that's maybe trying to figure out what they're in a more exploratory phase, they're trying to build an audience, but they're also doing like a lot of searching in what their maybe next steps are, what their focus is going to be. So it's tough to answer some of these questions around what exact demographic you're around, because you yourself are doing exploring. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I think, like I said, or like way at the beginning, I think you can proceed and do things like just start writing and just start creating without doing some of this preliminary work, but you'll just end up kind of experimenting and finding your way to a path that I think if you focus on this first, you'll save a bunch of time. So to answer your question about like, okay, then how do you figure this out first? I think you've got to start somewhere. right? And so again, if you ask yourself, if we go back to some of the questions from earlier here, it's like, what are your obsessions? Ask yourself these questions, and then think about the intersection of like what your obsessions are with what you can actually write about, what you're excited to write about. Start there, right? And start testing one of the things there or two of the things there, and start to see if you actually like want to pursue this, you know, into perpetuity or for a while, because that's really important with content. And start to get some feedback, right? Write 3 articles and see how they go, and use those 3 articles. Like in development, there's this like explore exploit tactic, right? Where you've got to like put stuff out there, you got to test things, and then you double down on what's working. So choose one of your obsessions, go test it, see if people care about it, see if you're getting any traction there. And then if you are, or let's start actually, if you're not, then maybe, you know, take a step back and explore something else. Now, if you are, then that's when I would say, okay, let's really double down on this, in terms of actually like pursuing it further, but then looping in that 100 True Fans thing, right? Of actually saying, okay, now that I have a path that I'm, you know, interested in pursuing and I have a little more confidence in, let me actually take the time to understand who I'm targeting and do some of these exercises. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Cool. All right, sounds like we've got everyone's questions for that section. So I've got, I think, 1 or 2 more slides. So these 2 are mostly summaries or just reminders. So with everything that you create online, I wish I didn't have to say this, but it's really important that you're solving problems, because the barrier to entry is so low. People create content just to create content just because they can. Now, I'm not judging them. If they want to do that, that's fine. But if you're looking to create an audience in the long term and actually, you know, get the attention, and I'm assuming that's why you're on this call, of people reading your stuff, you want to create a reputation of creating value. And so there's a saying, you know, be an aspirin, not a vitamin. A lot of content online is a vitamin. People don't need it. It just exists there. And sometimes vitamins are great, but the more you can be an aspirin, the more you can create something that people actually want. That is actually what leads to a level of virality. That's what I think a lot of people don't understand. People think things that are viral are often forms of like entertainment, right? Things go viral because people see them and they're like overjoyed by seeing this and they need to tell someone else. Well, actually what's underneath that is some problem that they had that is actually being solved in some way. And then they are so excited that this problem has been solved for them that they're going to go tell someone else about this. If no inkling of a problem has been solved, it's very rare and something will actually go viral, right? And that inkling can be anything from like, oh, that's something that I actually was thinking about, but didn't know how to parse out myself. Or this is something that, you know, this actually helps me address, you know, maybe not the acute problem at work, but actually helps me understand, like in general, how the workplace is impacting me on a day-to-day, and therefore, like, I'm gonna go share this on LinkedIn and all these people are gonna like it. And so again, most of the time, virality has to do with a problem being solved and someone wanting to solve that problem for other people. So there's this K factor in growth hacking, but it's also in, you know, unfortunately in pandemics, that's potentially where you've heard it from, but it's basically this factor that has to do with virality, how something spreads. And so what you want to do when you're creating content is make sure that you're creating things that solve problems so that your content does the work for you. And what I mean by that is similar to a product. You can put money behind a shitty product and it will get some users, but in the end, those users will churn and you'll just blow through a bunch of money. If you have a really great product, similar to a really great article, that product will require much less marketing. Your CPAs will be way lower. And in general, there will be a lot of people who you acquire who then help you acquire new users. The same thing is true with articles, right? So a shitty article or even a mediocre article, if you go through the 3rd chapter of this book and you learn about these distribution techniques, and you go and you post on Reddit and you post on LinkedIn and you post in communities and you learn about SEO, but it's a mediocre article, that article will have, you know, a K factor of less than 1. It'll die out pretty quickly. If you have even you know, just a decent article, you start to get a K factor of 1, right, or closer to 1. And then if you want to hit virality, you really need an excellent article that solves problems. And, if you can get that, basically, again, the article works for you. It requires a little bit of a nudge, but then basically, people are happy to share this for you. They're doing the work for you. So that is it. I'll quickly go through the summary. The summary is essentially the internet has redefined how we share information, both in terms of how we can create information, put it online, but also how it can be distributed and how we can reach other people. The lower barriers to entry definitely have resulted in a lot of content overload for many people, but what it hasn't necessarily done is completely eliminated gaps of really high quality content or content that serves certain purposes. And so something else to mention is that attention is, again, it's not returned in a linear fashion. So you must differentiate, but if you do, you can actually, get this disproportionate amount of attention because of the way the internet is able to reach this sense of infinite leverage. In order to stand out, you have to identify a position that people care about and become the best in that. Not the average of all the things that they might care about, but the best in that one area. The easiest way to start, if you're not sure where, what you should be trading on, is just to start with your obsessions, which is your personal monopoly, what you're really good at, what you are an expert in. And then regardless of what you choose as your personal monopoly or what you're actually targeting, you should be able to parse what you're doing into a single sentence, your what for who sentence. If you're unable to do that, then you probably are targeting something a little too broad at the beginning, or maybe not understanding exactly what you're trying to achieve. And then you should also, through your what for who, understand who your true fans are, so that you can actually go and reach them, and this will tie into distribution in future sections. And then finally, as I talked about on the last slide, no matter what you do, please don't just create content just to create content. Please go and try to solve problems, even if they're microscopic problems. Go try to actually provide value to people. And I promise if you do that, you will much more likely succeed in the content game. Sometimes just creating shitty content might give you a short-term blip, but in the long run, focusing on solving problems is your best way to succeed. So I think that's it. Oh, actually it's not, but I don't know if we want to go through this section. These are examples from people who entered in the type form, given that we just talked about the personal monopoly. These are a couple examples of people who sent in their ideas. And I think some of these are definitely works in progress. But I'd love to actually, let's do this. If everyone wants to take like a minute or so to read through what is currently on here, these examples, and have a think of, if you were giving this person feedback, or maybe you are the person who wrote this, where do you think that they can maybe iterate in a better direction? What's unclear? What feedback would you give on these personal monopolies, and how would you improve them? So take a minute to read them, and then whenever someone's ready, we can start sharing our thoughts. All right, so I've read through them. If you guys need a couple more seconds, feel free to keep reading. I'll comment on two of them to start. So the first one is the fourth one, so intersection of tech, society, and business. So I think this one, the first obvious thing is that what I think this is lacking is the who, right? The what for who. This kind of addresses the what, but within tech, society, and business, there are so many different personas of types of people that would read about tech, society, and business, and it's unclear, what in particular it's addressing. But then the second part is the what part of it on its own, I think, is also a little unclear, in the sense that are you talking about news for tech society and business? Are you talking about daily news? Are you talking about, long-term trends within tech society and business? Are you talking about something else? Why the intersection between these three things? To me, this one I think is a good start in that, you're niching down. You're not just talking about tech. You're not just talking about business. You're talking about this intersection of certain things. But I think it definitely needs to have an audience tied to it. And it also needs to niche down in terms of, or be more specific about, what type of information is it sharing within this intersection and why. And then the second one is down here, where I think this is a good example of one of the things that we recently talked about of multiple personas, right? So you've got biz dev and digital marketing for potentially Black or veteran creators and entrepreneurs. So there's like maybe 6 or so different personas in there that maybe overlap. But what I would encourage this person to do is, potentially one of these, if you focus on one of them, or potentially like, digital marketing entrepreneurs, let's say, or digital marketing for entrepreneurs. Potentially, if you focus on that, you'll capture, as I said before, some of these other subsets, or you can expand in the future. But I would say that this one is a great example of what I see often, where someone wants, the world and wants to target everything, and that's awesome. But when you try to do that, you end up actually, bringing in nobody. And so what I would advise that person to do is focus on one of these, like biz dev for creators or digital marketing for entrepreneurs or something. Maybe layer on one of these, but definitely not both of these at the moment, and start there and then expand. Does anyone have other thoughts about any of the others on here?
Yeah, I've got a thought.
A quick question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. The actionable insights and steps to learn new skills for 20-somethings focused on personal growth over mass socializing. I think that you're onto something here. I wonder why mass socializing is a detriment. As Steph says, you want to be aspirin instead of vitamins. I think you could reword this to say why that's the problem you want to solve. And in doing so, you can also kind of hone in on what kind of 20-somethings you want to appeal to.
I think that's great feedback. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I just think that maybe a lot of the whats are missing adjectives, like the ones you suggested for newsletters. And again, some of them don't have a clear who, which is the multiple personas thing that you mentioned too. Perhaps here in Becoming an Intermediate Ruby Rails Developer, a guide for junior Ruby Rails software developers is really good, but it would be better if the guide had an actual adjective. So like a very, like the quick guide to shoot your career up really fast, right? So I think it needs an extra like adjective.
I really like that, because I think what also sometimes people miss is they're describing something in terms of what it is, not what it does. It's like a common mistake in marketing, right? So you're saying like, okay, this is a guide. Okay, that's great. But what is someone who actually wants to become an intermediate Ruby developer? What do they want? Well, they want to, as you say, like get their next promotion, or up level their career, or get a raise, or whatever, right? And so targeting that instead of just saying, hey, like this is a guide for you to get better, really making it clear what will this actually get them? What is this thing that it will achieve for them? So I think that's really good feedback. I know there was someone.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, just really quick. I like the I help content creators and influencers to become entrepreneurs by creating and developing their digital business. I think that's great. I get a pretty good feel for what you're doing. I think you could just shorten it a little bit and give it almost a little bit more of a punch. So I help content creators and influencers build digital businesses, or you could even leave the to become entrepreneurs by building digital businesses, but some kind of way to like shorten that, and where it just has a little bit more punch to it and you get it really fast. That would just be a quick thought there.
Awesome. I know there was someone that I think one of us interrupted. I'm not sure if they ended up getting a chance to speak or not, but want to give them
I think that was probably me.
Cool.
So just like feedback from the group, my example is the last one. So the BizDev and digital marketing for Black or veteran creators and entrepreneurs. In general, I leave the Black and the veteran piece out, but I think aside from the fact that I worked in Silicon Valley for a few years in digital marketing, I think my differentiator is probably in one of these two groups, if not both, potentially. I'm not sure. But what would your strategy be in terms of deciding which of these two, in terms of maybe total addressable market, or what would your process be for figuring out which of these two, if you've got multiple options or multiple things that you think you might have expertise in? How do you decide which one to go with first?
So it depends on the situation, but the way that I would think about it is where does my expertise lie most closely? Like, who am I able to help the most? Do you know what I mean? Where it's like, sorry, I live near a train, everyone. But for example, if there's like 3 things that I can write about, and I'm not sure where to start, and I'm at this like beginning stage where I'm really trying to like build an audience, it's like who, you know, of those 3 groups, if I did go and create content for all 3, which one would actually benefit the most? Which one would I actually be providing tangible value for the most? Because those are going to become your true fans the quickest, right? And that's where you get that like jump start. And so you may go and choose one of these. Let's say you start with Black creators and entrepreneurs, and you do that, and you're able to provide the most value for them the most quickly. Start there. And then, as I said, you can expand, and then you can potentially create content for veterans as well. But I would focus on whoever you're able to tangibly provide value for the quickest and the most. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
No problem.
Hey, Steph, I had one question.
Sure.
What if we don't have a personal monopoly figured out yet?
So first question, are you creating content for yourself and in your own publication, or are you doing this for a company?
No, I was thinking about starting a blog. So wanted to, while I read through your first chapter of the book, I saw like you waited five years to like build that expertise, and then the time was right for you to hit the market. Sure. So is there any benefit in doing any kind of content publishing during those years when you have not figured out your personal monopoly that would be of help during that time?
Yeah, so my answer to this would be that definitely you don't need, again, if I go back to this, where is it? This slide. You don't need to be here, right? And even though I use my example of, you know, waiting X number of years, like there was no perfect time to do it. Like I didn't time that at the exact right moment where I got, you know, super lucky and everything came together because I launched at that time. Now, what you want to balance is that, you know, writing takes a lot of time, right? And that you're not just like aimlessly throwing stuff out there that people can't really benefit from because you're not really there yet, right? Like you don't really have something concrete to say. But as soon as you have something concrete to say, it's something that you feel like the world can benefit from, even if you're here, right? And all these people can learn something from you. Just get started as soon as you can, right? But just keep in mind that the further along this curve you are, the more likely that you're going to succeed, at least right at the beginning, right? Because if you start here, there's still, let's say like 10, 20% of people who can benefit from you, but it's harder to find those people. They may be like lower value readers. If you're way over here at the top, you have like 100%, 90% of people who exist that can potentially benefit, right? Within that topic. Do you know what I mean? And so there's no perfect time to start. I would say that if you are in particular looking to, you know, flex your writing muscle, then start like right away, right? Like if you're trying to just like get used to writing and like practicing that, get started right away. But if you are hoping to get results from your writing and you're doing this as like either a business or you're hoping to build your online following, I would be really like critical and ask yourself, do I have something unique to say? Like, have I worked towards something that other people have not spent the same amount of time doing? And that's what I meant when I gave my example of like, honestly, if I had started a blog in like let's say 2017, 2016, I would have just been talking about how I'm traveling the world and like I'm having fun, right? Which is fine, but that wouldn't have provided that much value to people. I could have done it if it's something that I would have enjoyed, but it was really later on when I had, flexed certain skills that it became, I had moved my way up this curve, that it became valuable to other people, and then it became more likely for my stuff to be read and for me to be able to build up an online publication. So again, I know that's a little bit of a vague answer, but the answer is you can start anytime, but you want to balance, obviously, that you're not like blowing all of your time for years writing about something that maybe isn't super valuable to the rest of the world. But as soon as you think that there's even an inkling of something that could benefit others, get started, and there's no perfect time to to flex your skills along this curve.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much.
No problem. All right, I know there's a big chat that I haven't been able to get through. I don't know if there's any additional questions.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's kind of like tangentially related on like getting started and stuff, but like how do you overcome like, I don't know, like your internal barrier, that internal voice that just says that, oh, maybe you should wait, maybe you're not there yet, and like, or how do you like face well, obviously this is one point, but also like perhaps like if you put out 1 or 2 articles out there and you don't get as much attention as you want, and how do you keep yourself going?
Yeah, it's a great question, because to your point, when you first start, especially, like even if you're writing the best articles in the world, no one will care, right? Because you don't have an audience yet. And so it is really hard to discern, like, am I going out and creating content that no one wants, or do I just not have an audience yet? And so this is a hard question to answer. I'll give you some ways to think about it. I'm not sure I have a perfect answer here, though. And one way you can think about this is just, again, like self-reflection in actually identifying, like, do I actually have some sort of advantage on this topic or on this subject? And be really honest, like, do I actually know something that other people do not know? And if you do, then focus on that and trust that, right? But don't second guess yourself in terms of, like, I'm publishing these things and they're not getting attention again if you're just starting out. I do understand that there's imposter syndrome and people who are like, oh, I'm not an expert, even when they are. But what I would try to do is, so one of the things that helped me at the beginning is I really wanted to write about remote work, and I didn't feel like a remote work expert. I wasn't, right? Like, what even is a remote work expert? No one knows. But what I did is I would go and read articles on the same topics, right? The exact same topics. I would search things that I wanted to know about remote work. So a good example is I was leading remote teams, and I always wanted to know, how do you actually build culture in remote teams? Because it's one of the hardest things to do. And I would actually search this in Google, and I would read articles, and I would feel like the articles were not super high quality, and B, I felt like I had actually explored this topic in my own mind past what I was finding online. And that was a signal to me of, like, you know what, I may not be the expert, because it's hard to even say what a remote work expert is, but I've spent enough time thinking about this and trying to think critically about this that I at least think that, I'm somewhere along the spectrum, above that halfway point. So I'm going to try this. And so I know that's not a perfect answer, but I would encourage you to go and, like, if you're unsure about your own work, go read the work out there on those topics and just try to compare, like, and be honest with yourselves in both ways, right? Am I actually, talking about this in a higher quality way? Yes or no? If it's no, then, maybe take some more time and become more of an expert in an area, or select another area that you have more expertise in. But I would actually encourage you to go read what you're competing with. And I think normally that will give you a pretty, like, visceral reaction of, like, oh, I can work with this, or like I'm on this level or higher, or not. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, sort of. I'll have to digest and think about that, but thank you very much.
Sure. Yeah, sorry, that one's really hard, because it's one of the hardest questions, whether you're, like, starting a startup or a blog or anything, where it's like, how do I know everything's slow at the beginning? How do I know if things are slow because I'm not doing things right, or because I'm at the beginning and things tend to be slow? And so try to look for signals that, even when you're early on, right? If you share an article with a community does that community go and like respond to you and say, that was a great article, Steph, like I hadn't thought of that before? Or does the community not respond, right? You don't necessarily, when you're early on, you can't look into Google Analytics and say, I'm up 10%, you know, traffic week over week or whatever. So just look for as many like micro signals as you can of people reacting to your stuff. And that honestly, it's not a perfect approach, but I do think that gives you enough signal to be like, oh, like someone actually found value in this. And even if you're early on, you may not get hundreds of thousands of page views or even thousands of page views, but I guarantee if you create an excellent article, you post it in a community that is for the right people, they either A, will talk about it, and or B, if it's amazing, they will go and share it for you, like I said. And that is the best signal. If you see people sharing your stuff without you asking, that's the epitome of, again, you provided value, you solved a problem for them, and you're doing a good job. So look for those signals, even though it can be difficult to kind of like see through the noise at the beginning. I'm reading through, if anyone else has questions, feel free to jump out, but I'm reading through. Paul asked, I have a question. Steph mentioned, oh, you guys found it. Yes, charter.co, CHARTR.co. Was there any other questions?
Steph, when you're ready, I have one.
What's that?
I said, when you're ready, I have a question.
Oh, sure. Yes, please.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. First of all, I want to thank you. Your objectives are help me. Your first lesson helped me put some things in place as far as what I'm, my differentiator, being funnier, concise, and visual. So what I wanted to ask you is, I do a lot of videos, but writing is not my thing. But one of the things I really like about Trends is the voice, right? Keeping a consistent voice, so many writers. So my job is now, everything in my mind, I want to get a writer who can convey that in the objectives I talked about. How do you guys manage to keep the voice and keep it funny and find writers who are consistent with that? Because that's really what I need to do. So any feedback on that would be great.
It's a good question, because it's funny, I've had people ask me, like, does The Hustle have really detailed guidelines on voice that everyone studies and trains on when they first start? And we don't. But with that said, we do mostly hire people who have been fans of The Hustle for a long time, right? So they've read enough of the content over like many emails that they get it. And again, I think sometimes people get confused with voice because they're like, it's a way of writing, but it's a tool, right? It's a way of communicating with people. And the best way to understand the voice that you're trying to achieve is to understand who you're trying to talk to, right? And so identifying who you're trying to talk to and always keeping that in mind helps you stick with the voice, more so than trying to think like, oh, I should use these types of sentences or structures or words, because that can be really tedious and you know, doesn't work most of the time. But just thinking like, again, I think the best way to think of written content is just imagining that, you know, your newsletter is your like cohort of relationships, your friendships, and you tend to create friends with a certain type of people, just like you create an audience with a certain type of people, and you talk to your friends in a certain type of way because that's your personality, right? And you talk about a certain group of things because that's what you care about and that's what you're an expert in, and you met these people because you went to certain types of events, you hang out in certain communities. And so I think online, because things are less personal, we tend to approach things in these like, again, like growth hacks, and like if you just do X, Y, and Z, then you'll get here. But try to just remember that everyone that you're talking to is a person with their own problems, their own personality, and they're choosing to engage with you. And I always like to say, I think I mentioned this in the book, that like people will talk about their lists as like, you know, I have a list of 11,000 people. And it's like, you have a list of 11,000 people who trust you currently, right? And so if you change things up in a way where you break that trust, like you don't have anything really, you've just formed relationships. And so the best way to think about voice and all of these things is just to think about who are the relationships that I've built, and like, how do I want to speak to them, right? And that comes through in a much more authentic way than, again, like setting rigid structures for like how you know, define voice, I think. And that's an opinion, but that's what I would say. And that's what's worked for The Hustle, because again, you would think we have this like very clear definition of the Hustle voice, and we actually don't. So I hope that helps.
That does help. So at the end of the day, I just need to hire from one of the Hustle viewers, readers, what I understood.
Well, just, you know, someone who like understands, like if you were to describe like what you're trying to go for, like who are the people that you're trying to reach?
Absolutely. So I just was writing that down. So what I'm trying to do is take that little piece within your trends, which is the global component to it. And I want to blow that up because that's what I do a lot of teaching and coaching in India. So I want to focus on global trends for entrepreneurs who are trying to up level their identification of trends and opportunities, right? So that's a long thing. I'm trying to shorten it. That's who I'm focused on, who are looking for what's happening around the world, global trends. And I know timing is the most important thing for most business to be successful. Painfully, I've learned a lot of those things. So I want to communicate that information concisely and visually. So
Got it. I mean, I think that's a great idea. My advice for you is you may like the hustle voice, but the hustle voice is curated at a different, or it's a similar audience, but not the same audience as what you're targeting. And so I would figure out what the voice should be for those people, and like hire like an Indian entrepreneur that you know is your target audience, and you maybe can, you know, copy or kind of like take parts of the hustle voice and use that, but that translates well to like the hustle's audience, which is overlapping but not the same as your audience. And so you would want to figure out what your audience actually resonates with. They might not actually resonate with the type of voice that the hustle has.
no, absolutely. That's good feedback. Absolutely. So what the point is, I'm funny in real life, but my writing really does not get that across. I'm trying to find a way for me to communicate that. So now that I know what kind of talent I need to hire. So that's really what I was going with.
Awesome.
Thank you.
No problem.
Hey, Steph, I have a question.
Sure.
It's a similar question that someone asked before, but I was hoping that you know, I can get some advice. So for someone who doesn't know where they stand on the scale of expertise on that slide that you had on before, one thing I noticed about myself is, so I'm a pretty avid reader and I enjoy consuming lots of random content. But for me, I have this belief that the information that I know is common knowledge to the general public, and I almost have this fear that if I do decide to share something, the replies I'll get, you know, they're just like, obviously everyone knows that. So I guess my question is, how do I know how much of an expert I am truly in a certain field or topic? And for someone who doesn't have content, because I know that you mentioned that, you know, why don't you test, right? And share an article and see what kind of feedback you get. How would you give advice for someone in a position that I'm in?
Definitely. And I think, I mean, this is like the most or such a common experience that, you know, before writing this book, I wasn't sure if I wanted to write it because I didn't know if it would be useful to people. Because when you do something for so long, you forget that so many other people haven't done the same things as you and don't have the same experiences or expertise. And basically, first, let me ask you, you said you're an avid reader. How many books a year do you read?
So not so much books, but I'm browsing articles all day.
Okay. All day.
So I do a lot of reading on Reddit, just like a lot of random stuff, and definitely on Facebook, and of course email. You know, I follow The Hustle. I've been following you guys for several years now. I'm also part of just a bunch of other groups. So I'm always trying to learn as much as I can, but I just don't know how much I know, how much of an expert I am.
So would you say that you spend more than 2 hours a day reading online content and trying to,
Yes.
to learn? Okay, well, I can tell you as an outsider, or not necessarily an outsider, but someone who has perspective outside of your head, that you read more content than the average person by far, right? And as long as you're reading content that is, you know, again, useful to the average person, I can almost guarantee that you have insights that the average person would benefit from. And you know, there's no, like, again, there's no cut and dry. There's no, like, you have to be exactly here on the spectrum. But I can guarantee that, you know, the average person, let's say, this is a guess, maybe spends 30 minutes a day reading online content. Some people much less, some people much more. The extra, let's say you read 2 hours. It sounds like you probably read a lot more than that. Let's say you even read 2 hours. Every day you're reading, you know, 4 times more content, right, than the average person. And so just imagine how that compounds over time. I know it's really, really hard when you're in the, like, you're in the thing to recognize where your expertise lies, but try to use some of those benchmarks and just think about, again, like, if you've spent more than an average amount of time learning something, that learning will be valuable to the average person. And in this case, it's, to me, as like a version of an outsider, I can almost guarantee that you do have something, or you've learned certain things that you can share. So now the challenge for you, at least it sounds like, is, okay, how do you identify how to actually capture that information and package it in a way that's useful to people? So that sounds, to me, it sounds like you've actually gone through the step that many people haven't, to become an expert in some way, in something. But there's still the step of like, okay, how do I actually make that expertise useful to people? That's where I would kind of encourage you to focus, because at least from an outsider's point of view, it sounds like you've gone through that first step.
Awesome. And what would you say for someone who's more of, in terms of knowledge, a jack of all trades, as opposed to someone who knows a lot about one specific niche? How would you try to package that? Because I know that it's quite easy, or I don't want to say easy, but it's more straightforward to package information on a very specific topic. But how would you package something that is general knowledge? It covers a lot.
So let me, I have a question for you, but let me first say that if you're targeting like complete general knowledge, like, absolutely every topic, and just, something like Reddit, I would encourage you not to compete there, because you're competing with algorithms, right? Like, if you go to the front page of Reddit has done that for you. Reddit has gone through every subreddit, found the stuff that people care the most about, and surfaced it at the top of Reddit. And same with Facebook, same with Twitter, etc. But what you can do is you can be a generalist within, slightly smaller areas. I'm not saying you need to niche down, but I would not compete across the board. You need to find something that, people care about, right? Because if not, you're competing with just straight up algorithms and you can't win there. So of the stuff you said you spend some time on Reddit, like, give me a couple examples of subreddits that you spend time on a lot.
The types of subreddits. So there's a few. I mean, I follow Life Pro Tips. I follow Today I Learned, and a few others. I mean, just random ones that aren't particularly all that useful, but Shower Thoughts, I think, is pretty cool. Ask Reddit. So
great.
Those are a few.
All right. So what you could do, I'm not saying this is exactly what you have to do, but one angle you could, it sounds like you spend a lot of time on like how people can improve their lives, right? Now, that's still pretty broad. You could start a newsletter or some sort of, publication on how people can improve their lives, but I would still say that's, that's pretty broad. Now, of the types of people that you think would benefit from this content, like, can you think of one persona? Doesn't need to be, again, a niche persona, but like a type of individual that could benefit from the things that you're learning about how they can improve their lives. So if you,
I see where you're going.
Yeah. So again, like, in your long-term goal could be that you create a much broader, newsletter or publication or whatever you're looking to build that talks about anything and everything. But there's a level underneath that where perhaps you start with how people can improve their lives. And then there's a level underneath that where perhaps you're starting with not just how anyone can improve their lives, but how, like, let's say, student entrepreneurs can improve their lives. And then there's a level underneath that where you understand, okay, student entrepreneurs care about X, Y, and Z. Maybe student entrepreneurs really hate reading all this like long form content, and they actually just, they love video content, or they love, content that's more visual, or that's created by other Gen Zers, right? Like things like that, where you're like, okay, I'm not just now creating this broad thing, where then you've started with something really broad. You've identified some subsection of that. You've identified who could benefit from that you're going to start out with. And then you've identified what does that person care about. And then you've got this like niche that you can start out with, right? And so I just gave you an example of what that funnel could look like, but there's many other examples of what you would find, given that you have such a like breadth of what you read every day. But that's kind of how I would think about it, and how I would go from something super broad where you're competing with algorithms to something that's actually actionable that you can start out with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, funneling the information. Yeah, super helpful. Thank you so much.
Cool, no problem. All right. Looks like people are dropping off. A lot of people had to go. It was a super long call. Does anyone have any final questions? Happy to stay on if you do. If not, we'll close this out.
Really quick, Steph. This is
Sure.
Dylan. I guess I'm coming from the podcast sense, but with building an audience and picking the niche, my idea is sort of the smart content for 20-something entrepreneurs, but funnier. Like most people don't talk like 20-somethings. Is that niche enough? And now I just need to find like a Reddit or the Twitter in group. Like, what should I do to go from where I'm at now to testing it?
So the way I like to think about like, is it niche enough, is like, again, niche or saturation isn't number of people there, but it's like, can you out innovate what exists, right? And so what I would do is, to answer that question, what you need to do is go find out, does that exist yet, right? In that scope, that like kind of wide scope, but not super wide scope. If it doesn't, you can start there, right? Because that's an unmet need amongst that audience. Now, if you find that there is something that exists where it's like, it's targeting these young folk about this specific topic, it's doing this in this really funny way, it's gonna be really hard for you to, to do better, right? If someone's doing exactly that. Now, you may decide, I actually think I can do it better. They're kind of funny and I think I can be funnier. Then you can also decide, like, I'm gonna bet on myself being able to trade on this humor and being able to do that better. But if you go out and you find, someone actually does this, then that's when you might decide to go a little more niche and maybe say, I'm not just targeting students, I'm targeting students in, this part of the country. Or maybe I'm targeting students who like are in tech, or you know what I'm saying? Or maybe you approach it from another perspective where you're not segmenting the student part more, where you're segmenting the topic part more, right? But in order to know how deep you need to go, it's just addressing like what exists at that level, and can I compete at that level? You know what I'm saying? And you, again, as I've mentioned many times in this call, you can level up and expand, but you want to find a level that you feel comfortable that you can penetrate, right? That you have an easy in at. Do you know what I'm saying? And then you can expand past that.
I'm picturing like, I don't know, those things in science class where you have like a bunch of large rocks and then they get smaller and smaller to sand, like figuring out, I don't know, that maybe the analogy doesn't make sense, but like how deep you have to go before you carve out your space.
Yeah, a good way to think about this is like, so if let's say there is a podcast that, can you remind me on what was the topic that you said?
It's called Smart Nonsense. It's basically smart entrepreneurship topics.
Awesome. Cool. So entrepreneurship topics, let's imagine there is a podcast that talks about entrepreneurship for, Gen Zers, and it's pretty good. And you're not sure like exactly how to like do better than that. Well, there's some cohort of those Gen Zers listening who care about entrepreneurship, who really care about, like, let's say entrepreneurship in tech, or entrepreneurship in maybe something not like tech is super common, right? So maybe something even more niche that is more fun and you can actually play a lot more with, right? And what you can do then is, instead if you entered at that level of the broad, just like entrepreneurship level, then how are you going to convince all these, these potential people who already listen to podcast X that yours is better? That's much harder to do than to be like, hey, actually, you care about this, right? Well, this is a podcast that actually focuses more on this, right? And so you're finding, again, your first fans, right? And then it's easier to grow off of an initial existing fan base than to try to like scoop up people who are happy with what they already have. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, basically take what's out there, and then if I can't compete at that level, just get like a sub demographic within that.
Yeah, and again, the demographic could be based on, a certain type of student, certain part of the country. It could be a certain part of entrepreneurship. You can find different ways to cut it, but you want to find a way to cut it that you do have an edge, right? Because and just kind of reiterating, like, you might have an edge at that level, but you need to stop. You need to figure that out, right? You need to see if there is someone doing what you're doing exactly how you're doing it. And again, if you think there's some way that you can differentiate through humor better than what exists out there, that is an edge in itself. But you kind of have to be honest with yourself about these things. Like, do I actually think I can do X better? Do I actually think people who listen to this?
Am I actually funny?
Well, I guess it's a funny way to put it for like humor, but you know what I'm saying? Like, do I really think that I have an edge in this space? And if not, like, how do I create one? Well, in some cases you niche down, in some cases you focus on being funnier or whatever. But I think this is where sometimes people aren't honest with themselves, not with humor specifically, but just where they're like, oh yeah, I can do this. But it's like, you really think that you can create like a better email than X? Like, they're doing pretty well. And so like, what do you think you actually can do better? You have to kind of be honest with yourself and isolate whether that's true or not, you know?
Dylan, have you gotten the chance to speak to a lot of 20-something entrepreneurs?
I just talked to Brandon Zhang. I don't know if you're big on Twitter, but he's kind of, well, yeah, basically a lot of friends from school. Those have been easy, and then slowly branching out within Twitter to some followers.
By the way, in general, again, I don't know if it exists, so I can't say if like how easy it will be, but I love the idea of creating content specifically for Gen Z because they are completely different than all the other generations, and they don't like, that's almost like what Morning Brew did, but for a slightly different demographic, is they basically said, we're gonna, Wall Street Journal does, finance for older people, markets, economics, etc. But it's really boring for these younger people, not Gen Z, but, like more like, millennials. And so they basically isolated that and they said, we're gonna make this for millennials. We're gonna make it choppier, like shorter. We're gonna make it funnier, etc. And I think there's an even further level to that because Gen Z and millennials, like there's such a big gap between those and how they consume content. So I think it's a great idea. I just don't know the space super well, so I don't know how competitive it is. I don't know what exists there currently.
So once sorry to hog a lot of time, but basically get the tagline, and that's like the first thing, whether it's in the intro of the podcast or on your webpage, you're like, a one-liner is ideal for when people just show up, and that's what we're trying to discern. Yeah, so I mean, a one-liner is good because it's good for two reasons. One is that it helps you get to the point where you have clarity as to what you're building, right? But it's also important that, like Morning Brew, it was so easy for millennials to understand the Wall Street Journal for millennials. They're like, I get it. I have this problem that I want to consume content about economics and finance, but I hate reading these long form articles on the Wall Street Journal, right? And so you get to the page and someone understands, A, I know what I'm going to get, and B, this addresses a problem that I care about, right? And so the one-liner should do that for your core fans, right? So that some Gen Zer come in here is like, oh yeah, like I totally care about this topic, but there's nothing really that like feeds it to me in a way that I like. And that one-liner would capture that, right? And it's almost like signaling that like these are your people, right? You want to be part of this for these reasons. But like a short sentence that can achieve that is so powerful. It's hard to do, but it's powerful. Awesome. Thank you, Steph. Appreciate it.
No problem. All right. Anyone else? I know there's some people still listening in, but I know we've been on for a while. So if no one else has any questions, thanks so much for staying this whole time and sticking with it, everyone. This was really fun for me. And yeah, there's going to be sessions like this every single week on every chapter.
Yeah. So I'm just curious to know. So if I turn up to this session now, because I'm technically in like a different time zone, it's like midnight here for me. Mm-hmm. And so like if I turn up to the other session, so will it? Oh, because I remember that you mentioned in your first emails that you do them to move them to Wednesdays. I was wondering whether you're just going to keep the Thursday, Friday format, or in terms of like logistics, how is it going to be like moving forward?
Yeah, so I know I apologize. There's a lot of mix-ups because I just did not expect this many people to buy the book in the short period of time before the live session started. But moving forward, they're staying at Thursday mornings, Friday nights, so that it covers different time zones. So the Friday, did you say you're in Asia currently?
Yeah, I'm in
Yeah.
Hong Kong, so
So-
we're it's like 1 a.m. in the morning now.
Okay, well, thanks for staying with us. But yes, the Friday night call then would probably be around like 10 or 11 a.m. your time on Saturday. So it is Saturday, but yeah, those are the times. But if you can't make them, they're all recorded, and there's a form where you can add questions beforehand if you can't make it. So yeah. All right. Cool. Well, thanks so much, everyone. I'm available if you're not in the Telegram chat. Make sure to join. I think I set up a bit.ly link. It's bit.ly/DCR-chat. Let me quickly double check that. Let's see. Yes, sorry, not bit.ly.com, bit.ly/DCR-chat. Sorry, DCR-chat. That's where you can join us in Telegram, and I send a few more updates there, but any important updates are sent out through email. So yeah, thanks so much, everyone, and hope to see you next week or in future weeks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steph. Bye.